Your alternative talk radio contact. The Planet. KGRAradio.com.
With infinite complacency, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design, man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
Welcome to another episode of Into the Fray, hovering over you like a black triangle in a deserted field. Visit the mothership at intothefrayradio.com. There you can find all the episodes, the blog posts, ITF gear, and sign up for the free guest newsletter. The weekly show is, of course, always free and available in all podcatchers, but if you'd like to support the show, and why wouldn't you, go to the website and click Become an Insider, which in turn gets you extra content each and every month. And by the way, if you would be so kind as to leave a rating and review in your listening platform of choice, Cosmic Karma shall be yours. Be part of the discussion by joining the interactive ITF Facebook group. Follow on Twitter at ITF_radio and Instagram. If you have an experience that you'd like to share, email Shannon at intothefrayradio.com. Thanks so much for listening. Now, if you would be so kind, buckle up your safety belts. Put that tray table in the upright position. Liftoff is upon us.
What's new and exciting?
Oh, not much. Well, other than, trying to get ready for the book coming out this week and just all that, keeping busy. So,
well, a huge congrats on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just a reminder to everybody that this is John's second visit back on Into the Fray. The first was episode 99, and that was, of course, titled the same as the book, Stranger Bridgerland, and this one is Beyond Stranger Bridgerland. So, yeah, welcome back. I was super happy to hear that, the second one was coming out this week. I didn't know it was coming so soon. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate that.
Because I know that at the end of the last time we talked, you were saying that, I've already got some stories kind of flowing in, so may as well go for that second one, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I still had a stack. And since the first book came out, I've had even more coming in, and so it's been kind of a struggle to pick which ones to put in this next book.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, and like usual, I had to kind of rein myself in because there were so many good stories in here. I'm like, well, I don't want to, keep them on for a 3-4 hour episode and go through all of the stories. You have to save some for the readers, so I picked about 5 or 6, I think, to have you touch on this round.
Oh, that's awesome. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Now, most of the stories just have the people's first names, and I assumed, especially the way that you opened the book with Grandma's Snowman, that was you and your family that you were talking about?
For the first one, you mean?
Yeah.
Or yeah, that was actually kind of a reintroduction, and yeah, that was my family and my son that happened to. So,
because he was the one that was having all of that activity go on, kind of centered around him anyway, and then this darn snowman just didn't seem to want to leave him alone. Will you touch on that really quickly before we dive into the main ones that I chose?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, the ghost that lives in my parents' house that I actually grew up with there, he seemed to pick on my son. I think he's really kind of a trickster, and when he finds somebody that it seems to bother more than others. He seems to pick on that person. And my son, for whatever reason, I always told my son it was because he was disrespectful to me, which was just kind of a joke between us.
Right. Like, stop picking on your dad and maybe he'll leave you alone, right?
Yeah, exactly. But when he was around 15, my oldest, Grandpa paid him to paint the basement. And when I was growing up, it was a family room in the basement, but it's since just turned into storage. They moved the family room upstairs and turned that into storage. And my mother had this snowman that she had gotten, and it was a heavy duty snowman. It was made out of heavy cloth and had a sandbag in the bottom, and it stood about 4 feet tall. And so it's kind of hard to move, but really kind of a nice one. And during Christmas time, she would have it upstairs, and it tended to move a little bit when it was upstairs and nobody was home. One of those things. And my son, for whatever reason, didn't like the snowman. And so it came time, it was summertime, and he was painting for my dad. And to kind of give you a background, there's only one entrance to the basement, and it's through the stairs and a little tiny hallway. And so my son, he being about 15, had his headphones on, and he was painting the hallway. And he said he started getting just a kind of a creepy vibe, and looked into the poked his head around the corner, and the snowman is in the corner facing him. And he didn't like the snowman from things that had happened before. So he marched in and turned the snowman around and put it in the corner, almost as if it was in timeout. He put it in the corner and went back to painting, and went about 10, 15 minutes, and he started getting that creepy feeling again, and took his headphones off and stuck his head around the corner. And not only had the snowman turned all the way around, it was now halfway across the room to where he was. And he marched upstairs to my dad and said, "Grandpa, I am not painting that room if that snowman is downstairs." And so it went on the porch outside until Grandma decided to get rid of it permanently. But yeah, it was just one of those things that happened every once in a while, that the ghost let my son know that he was there, and he was going to play tricks on him. So.
Do you think it was the situation where he had said out loud, maybe at some point, "Oh, that thing gives me the creeps," like maybe before anything really started, and the visitor to the home kind of got wind of that and goes, "Oh, okay, I can use that on him," right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly it. That he wouldn't even have bothered him with it, but he kind of knew that the snowman gave him the creeps to begin with. So. And it was it had a sandbag in the bottom. It wasn't, easily moved kind of a thing. So.
And it's always just somewhere down in a darn basement for some reason, right? Like, why is it always going to be the basement? And poor kids just trying to get a chore done, make a little cash flow, and then the snowman just keeps picking on him.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's jump in here. A lot of these gave me the creeps, which is amazing because I love creepy stories. And I'm sure you know which one really kind of hit home with me as far as the shadow people go, and the idea of maybe why they're around or what they're doing and their nicknames. And I kind of saved that one for last. But let's jump into this story that was told to you by Andy, and it is Lost Pioneer Boy. This one was... pretty darn striking, if you ask me. I would be out of the woods really quickly.
Yeah, so if you've noticed with quite a few of my stories, especially the older ones, just growing up in northern Utah, I had a lot to do with, people who hunted and spent a lot of time in the wilderness. So, of course, I have quite a few stories regarding being in the wilderness and people hunting. And this one came to me from a friend of a friend who had heard that I was collecting stories, and he came to me, and him and his brother had been hunting deer, and they decided that they were going to try their luck at a place called Scare Canyon, which I think is interesting that, a lot of times there's places named, Scare Canyon or Devil's This or Devil's That. And it ends up being a spooky place, but nobody can remember how it got the name or why it is. But he obviously found out why he would call it Scare Canyon, later on.
Yes, he did.
But so they had hunted all day and not seen, they'd only seen a few people and not many deer. And it was getting close to the end of the day, and they were at the top of Scare Canyon. And I've been to Scare Canyon. It's an interesting place. It actually goes down, and instead of making its way out, it's like a big bowl at the end. And so there's not a real good way out at the bottom. You have to hunt from the top and hike in and back out from the top. And they were up near the top and started hearing something strange, somebody crying, which was really a weird place for them to hear that. And so he followed his older brother, and they went going through the brush to try and find out, what this was they were hearing and if somebody needed help. And they came to a little clearing, and here's this little boy, about 8 or 9 years old. He said he was dressed basically in pioneer garb, in homemade shirt and pants. He didn't have shoes on, and he was down with his knees hugged to his chest, and he was crying. And his first thought was, how did a little boy get up here? Because I hadn't seen anybody, all day. And his brother asked him if he was okay, and he looked up, and he remembered great detail, including he had blue eyes, that his face was dirty, streaked with tears through it, and the little boy pointed down towards his left and their right, and they were trying to see what the boy was looking at. And in the process, the little boy disappeared, completely disappeared right in front of them. And they were in shock. He was in shock. And it wasn't until his brother punched him in the shoulder and took off running back towards the vehicle that he came to and was like, yeah, we've got to get out of here. And so they made their way out. But it was interesting that he said that it was several years before his older brother would even talk to him about it. He didn't even want anything to do with talking about it for a long time. It was such a distressing thing to him. It wasn't even like he was see-through when they first saw him. They thought it was a real boy at first, and he just completely vanished right in front of them.
I wonder what he was pointing at.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what I was wondering too. And I asked him if he ever went back, and he said he never ever went back hunting in that area or hiking back in that area again.
Wow.
Yeah.
And, there's all kinds of stories about settlers, and goodness knows what happened on this piece of land or that piece of land. But yeah, I was just going, I wonder what that little boy was pointing at right there. Because he was obviously interacting with those guys to a certain extent until he disappeared. So that was very interesting.
Yeah, he was trying to tell him something. So I don't know. It would be interesting to see, but it's one of those mysteries, Well,
I can't blame him for not wanting to go back out there. So even his brother to this day, even to this day, he won't talk about this experience?
Well, it's been several years since I interviewed him, but he said that his older brother didn't like to talk about it, and it had been after a while, he finally said, when his brother finally would talk to him about it, and just him, that was when he finally got to the point that they had both seen exactly the same thing, that his brother's recollection of what the little boy looked like was exactly the same, and that they had the same experience, which, when something disappears in front of you like that, you don't know whether you really had the same experience or not.
That's pretty amazing, though, because a lot of times when you just see the word ghost and you just think of something very ethereal and see-through, but both of them just thought they were, there's a lost little kid. He's crying. You see the blue eyes and the streaks of the tears and the dust on his face. That's amazing.
Yeah. He was, I mean, he said it was amazing the details that he remembered too. Because this was in the 70s when it had happened. So it's been quite a while. So.
Well, I think this next one is another one of yours, John. A really striking story called Last Motorcycle.
Yes, this did happen to me actually. So, um, it's interesting. This one's a little bit different story. It's not so much spooky as well. It is spooky, but more. I don't know. I don't know what you would call it with getting a message, I guess, from the other side. So ever since I was young, I've had a motorcycle. I had a motorcycle. It was one of my favorite things to do was to ride, and I always had a motorcycle. And I remember I was married, and we just had the youngest or the oldest. I wasn't very old, about 3. And I had purchased a motorcycle from my uncle, and I was really excited about this motorcycle. It was kind of a classic, and not very many miles on it. And I was on my way home from work, and I was pulling up to a right turn, and there was a line of cars that had left a gap, and a lady in a car shot the gap, and didn't see me. So she struck me, and I went over the handlebars, and miraculously I only separated one rib. It was kind of miraculous that I didn't get hurt more because it totaled the motorcycle. Totaled the motorcycle. And the saying when you ride motorcycles, it's not if but when you're going to get hit. And so even though it was a scary experience for me, I was still gung-ho to get a new motorcycle and get back on the road. And it had been about a month, and the insurance company had finally given, the money to purchase a new motorcycle. And I'd been looking for a motorcycle. And well, one afternoon, it was interesting. My wife and my son and I went to the grocery store to just get groceries. And I put my son in the cart, and as I did, there was a gentleman down the aisle that I made eye contact with. And it was just a very weird feeling when I saw him. He kind of seemed to have, dirtier clothes, and just kind of his jeans seemed ripped up, and I kind of tried to brush it off, but it was just a really weird experience. And so we continued shopping, and every once in a while I would see him at the end of the aisle, and we would make eye contact, and I would just kind of nod, and went like this throughout the whole store. And finally we got near the end, and my wife at the time, she was going to go get the milk, and I was going to take the cart and my son and get the cereal, and we were going to meet up front. And there wasn't a lot of people in the store. Oddly enough, I kind of come from a smaller community. So, even though I don't know everybody's name, I'm actually pretty good with faces. And it kind of bothered me that I didn't know who this guy was. And just something seemed off. But we went down the aisle, and I was looking at the cereal, and all of a sudden I became very aware that there was somebody behind me. And I turned, and here's this guy standing right next to the cart and right next to my son, and he's staring right at me. And it was at this point I noticed that he had what looked like road rash on his arm and his leg, and he smiled at me and smiled at my son, and then looked at me, and he says, "You have a very beautiful family." And I just got this really weird feeling inside. And I said, "Thank you. Yeah, it's a great family." And he was quiet for a second, and he looked at me, and he was looking directly into my soul when he said this. And he said, "I used to have a family, but I can't be with my family anymore. Do you understand what I'm saying?" And it was at that point that I knew he was telling me I was never supposed to have another motorcycle again, which sounds really strange, I know, but and he looked at me again and said, "Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you?" And I said, yeah, I understand what you're telling me. And he smiled at my son again and walked down to the end of the aisle. And so I went down to the aisle just to see where he'd gone, but I knew before I even got there that he wasn't going to be there. And he wasn't. He was completely gone. And so I went to the front and met my wife, and I asked her about, did you see that guy? And even though he'd been at every aisle, she had no recollection of seeing him whatsoever. And I just knew deep in my soul that it was a warning from the other side that I was never to have another motorcycle. Very long time to come to grips with, because I just love motorcycles. I still to this day see people driving and I get a little jealous when you're following a guy that's on a motorcycle and a guy's coming from the other direction and they do their hand,
right.
A motorcycle, we're cool, and I just go, oh, that kills me. But I also know that if I were to purchase another motorcycle, that I might not be here. In fact, I'm 100% sure I wouldn't be. I wasn't supposed to have another motorcycle, so it was a warning from the other side, and I'm not going to take that for granted, even if it does kill me a little bit inside.
Yeah, what a cool story. I mean, and especially what you mentioned about it being a small town, and somebody like that would have stood out, not only because nobody knew who he was, but because, like you said, he had some injuries and his clothes were a little ripped and dirty, and he would have stood out to people. So I love that story. And you know what it reminded me of is from Pet Sematary. Wasn't there a young man that kept showing up and he would show himself to the father, and his was really graphic. I mean, part of his head was smushed, but it reminded me of that portion of Pet Sematary, that young man that kept popping up, and he had been in an accident of some sort. So anyway, love that story. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I guess you got that message loud and clear, huh, John? He did his job then.
Yes, he did, because I never did purchase another motorcycle. So.
And that was only like you said around a month later. You had the check, but you were taking your time looking at that point, right?
Yeah. I was looking and trying to figure out, what motorcycle. I'd looked at a couple, and so I was right in that zone of, getting my next motorcycle, and yeah. So the warning came not to do it. So luckily, I heeded the warning. So.
Well, this next one had an element that I don't know that I've quite heard of before, and I was like, I have to ask John about this one. And this one was submitted by a gentleman named Travis to you, and it is entitled Cup UFO, and it's in Idaho.
Yes. So this was one that somebody contacted me when they read my first book. They contacted me and talked to me. So Travis, and that's not his real name. I changed his name. There is a few that I've had to change names because they said, "Oh, you're more than welcome to use my story. Please don't use my name," which I understand. But he was going to school and working for a company where this is up in Idaho Falls, if I'm remembering correctly, and his job was delivering auto parts all over the West, kind of in this area, to different shops. And he would travel all over from West Yellowstone to Jackson Hole and different places in Wyoming. And it was kind of, a lot of it was local for him, but he did have some longer hauls like that. And it was just using his own vehicle. And it was a Thursday night when it was just about closing time, and he was getting ready to go home, and his boss called him in, and he had a call for some parts to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and it was an emergency call that they needed the parts. So his boss told him, "Look, if you go tonight, I'll pay for your hotel and your food, and then you can take Friday off." And he jumped at the chance because he said, "Well, I'm just going to throw my bedroll in the back of my truck and say, have a nice dinner, and then save my money, save the money I would have spent on a hotel, and he was planning on driving down to Soda Springs, which is south of Jackson, to visit his family after the next morning on Friday. So he gets the parts and loads up his truck. He had a little truck with a camper shell on it and headed for Jackson Hole. Gets to Jackson Hole, delivers the parts, has a nice dinner, and then starts heading towards Soda Springs. And between Jackson Hole and Soda Springs, there is a canyon. It's called Tin Cup, and it's just a windy 2-lane road with a little spring or a little, it's not even a river. It's just a small stream that comes down the canyon. It's actually a really beautiful place. And he stops there for the night and puts his bedroll out in the back of his bed, or the bed of his truck, and goes to bed. And middle of the night, he wakes up with a bright light in his truck and a hum that's vibrating the camper shell over the top of him. And he's trying to figure out where this is coming from. So he puts on his shoes and he gets out of the truck. And to the west, in front of the truck, he's pulled off the road on a pull out down far away from the road. There is a ship, a triangular ship, parked. I can't remember exactly, about 100 yards up from where his truck is, and there's a beam going from the bottom of this triangular ship down to the riverbed, and it's sucking up water. He can see the water shimmering through the light as it's being sucked up into the ship. And he's kind of just flabbergasted watching this happen. And he's thinking, do I jump in my truck? Do I drive away? What's going on? He said he'd never even really thought much about UFOs or anything like that until this moment when it's right in front of him. And all of a sudden, the hum stops and the light shuts off that was going from the ship down to the riverbed. And he says he was close enough that he could hear the water that was in the column that didn't make it to the ship fall back down to the water with a splash. And he said he noticed that once the beam shut off and that the hum completely quit and it was dead quiet. He couldn't hear anything. There wasn't anything in the forest moving. There wasn't, anything from the ship. It was just completely silent. And he watched it for a minute, and then it was, it started moving slightly, and then it was gone. It shot up and disappeared. And he, like you said, he got in his truck and left, but he'd never really thought much about UFOs before. But since then, he was, very fascinated and learning as much as he could about it. But he felt like he was really extremely lucky to have seen something like that. And you mentioned, you've never heard of anything like that. I hadn't either, but what's odd is in my collecting of stories, it's not in this book or the first book, but I had a story that I collected from a sheep herder that was about 80 miles south of this gentleman and about 15 years difference time that had seen something very similar happen, where a ship was drawing water up from a river in the same manner. The only thing that's different between the stories is the sheep herder said that it was your classic round dish-shaped UFO, and this gentleman in Tin Cup, his was triangle-shaped. But other than that, their explanations, they've never met each other. They've never talked. Explanation was exactly the same, with the hum and the water being drawn up and everything like that.
That is so interesting about the second story. So the circular craft was 15 years prior to the triangle?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was 15 years prior.
Maybe that's the new model, right? The new model is the triangle shape.
It's the triangle, yeah. I just thought it was interesting that they both talked about basically the same thing with the blue beam and the hum, the water being transferred up, and then Yeah, and like I say, the only difference is the one that was on the Cache National Forest, which is one I haven't written up yet, was the circular, classic dome circular UFO, and this one was a triangle shaped one.
So that didn't scare him at all. He just feels lucky to have seen it.
Yeah, I mean, at the time he was a little frightened after it had just happened, but yeah, he does feel lucky that he got to see it. It's something that people, a lot of people dream of seeing. I would really love to have seen something like that, but
yeah, I agree. And I just, it painted such a cool picture of the beam coming down, and the water is doing its thing, and then all of a sudden when it's time to go, the water just splashes back down. That's still underneath the craft. I really like that aspect of it.
Yeah. It just holds, like you say, it painted quite a picture when he was explaining it to me. So.
All right, now this next one, I'm going to have to say is probably on my no list, especially if you're out. And I think that this guy was supposed to go with someone else, but ended up going alone. This is Trolled on Mount Naomi by Brad. And I'm like oh no, no, on the no list.
This is actually one of my favorite ones. So I met this guy. It's actually been probably about 10 years ago, and we happened to at the time be working together, and we were talking, and I explained that I was working on a book and taking stories, and he came back to me later and said, wow, I had something happen to me. And he says, and you're going to think I'm crazy, but I swear, this is what happened to me. And so, he told me a brief story, and I said, oh, we've got to sit down. I've got to, get all the details. And basically, he came to visit a friend here in Cache Valley, and then fell in love with Cache Valley. He's a huge outdoors fanatic, rock climbing, hiking, you name it. He loves to do it, skiing, snowboarding. And we're in Cache Valley where I live, we're so lucky to be like 10 minutes from the mountains and from hiking, fishing, 2 ski resorts. It's just, and so he'd moved here in his 20s, young guy. And him and his buddy had planned to hike to Mount Naomi, which is one of the high peaks here in the valley. And last minute, his friend had to cancel on him, and he decided he was going to go anyway. It was about this time of year, August, and what happens a lot, as you know, in August in the West, there was a no burn on. You couldn't have a campfire. You can't have anything. Mm-hmm. And even though the Mount Naomi hike, you can make that in a day, up and back. But he really wanted to take his time, and he knew he was going to get a late start. So he took his bedroll and took some, food to eat that he could just eat without cooking, and, threw it all together and headed up there. Where you park is called the Tony Grove parking lot. It's a campground, and it's pretty high up there. And because of his work schedule, he was able to go during the week when it's not real busy. During the weekends, it's kind of a busy place. I mean, it's really popular place for people to hike and camp. And it wasn't very busy, few cars here or there. And so he, got his pack and headed off. And you climb pretty good in elevation. You start pretty good in elevation with that hike. And so at that high, you have some old pines and some brush and a lot of rock. There's lots of granite rocks, and it's really kind of a beautiful hike. So he got going and got so far and decided he was going to take a break for the night and rest. And so he put out his bedroll and had his dinner. And one thing that he always does when he goes is takes his headlamp, and he takes an old book. He always takes an old book with him because he likes to read right before he goes to bed. And so he watched the stars for a while, watched the sunset, ate, read his old book with his headlamp, and then went to sleep. Sometime in the night, he wakes up, and he's not quite sure exactly what woke him up. He says he's a very heavy sleeper, so it takes quite a bit to wake him up. And he hears a whistling, and it's very strange to him because it doesn't sound like a bird, and a lot of birds don't call at night, and it almost sounds like somebody's trying to call somebody, trying to call to him. It's kind of a strange whistle, and he's getting kind of nervous because that's the only sound. There's no bugs, there's no nothing. It's really quiet. So he's trying to find his headlamp, and he can't find his headlamp, and so he crawls out of his bed and he slips on his shoes. And as he's slipping on his shoes, he gets hit in the chest with a rock. It's about the size of a quarter. And it wasn't really hard, but it was really strange. He's like, why would I get hit with a rock? What's throwing rocks? And what's funny is when he's telling me this, the first thing that I thought of was when he was telling me this was actually Sasquatch. Sasquatch was messing with him, and at this point when he's telling me this, I'm convinced that's what it is. But he gets his shoes on, and that's when he realizes that he's got his headlamp still on his head. And so he flips on his headlamp and looks towards where the whistling and the rocks coming from. And sitting on a pile of boulders, like of rocks and boulders, about 15, 20 feet away from him is this little creature. And he's trying to explain it to me the best he can. It's green-gray. It's got very pointy features. And as he's explaining it to me, and later on when I was trying to explain it, what came to me is kind of like in Harry Potter with the house elves or the goblins that they show in there is very similar to what he's explaining. Black eyes, ears and nose is sharp and pointy, and it's wearing old clothes, torn up clothes. And he goes kind of into shock at seeing this because he says something like this is not supposed to exist, and he says, I'm a very rational person, but here is sitting, 15, 20 feet from me, 15 feet, this creature. And it gets a smile on its face and starts whistling at him, which now he realizes that's obviously where the whistle was coming from. And he notices in one of its hands it's trying to slide something behind it. And he looks down, and this creature has his book in his hand. And he says for some reason that's what snaps him out of this shock state, because he realizes that this creature, whatever it is, has been close enough to take this from him. It's been right next to him and taken it from him. And so he hurries and gathers up all his stuff as quick as he can, his bedroll into his arms, and starts running for the trail because he's off the trail a little bit. He trips and falls. Trying to gather up his stuff, he can hear the whistle, and it's coming from closer, behind him. So he realizes this creature, whatever it is following him or whatever. And he just freaks out, gets what he can, and runs down the trail all the way to his vehicle. Throws his stuff in his vehicle and sits in his car for a little bit, and then finally takes off and goes home. He said that it taken him a long time to come to grips with what he had seen, because, like he said, something like that is not supposed to exist. It's that's fairy tale stuff. It's not real, and he wasn't. Even when I talked to him, he wasn't big into paranormal or anything like that, but this experience had really shaken him up.
Yeah, there's so much nope in that story. Like he did, because I was reading and he's got the description of what it looked like, right? And I'm going, nope, that would really be horrifying. And then to realize that it had his book, which he fell asleep reading, so it was goodness knows where, on his chest or right next to him, obviously. It was right there to come up and snatch the book. And what the heck's it going to do with this book anyway? It's just like it's messing with him.
Right. And it's interesting. After he told me this story, I did some of my own research. And it's interesting because the Native Americans do have a history of creatures like this that they talked about. Now, some of the biggest problem with Native American history and folklore is it was all verbal. So much has been lost. But they did talk about creatures that like this, that were mischievous, that stole things, that they talked about, them having, their own stuff in the mountains. And I found it interesting because there's a lot of places, whether you are in Western Europe or North America or China, whatever, they talk about creatures like this in their culture and in their folklore. And they call them by different names, but it all kind of boils down to the same thing. It makes you, wonder, what's going on with that.
It makes me wonder also about the whistle that I heard while I was in Salt Fork, because I've talked about that so many times. And then when I read this, and this little dude is just, he doesn't care, obviously, that this guy has seen him, and he's actually grinning at him. Did he mention at all did it have human-like teeth? Were its teeth sharp? Did he mention anything about that?
It seemed like they were just sharp, like sharp teeth, kind of.
God, what is it eating that it needs sharp teeth?
I know. That's so strange. And, it's interesting. I think about it, and, I've had several people that I've talked to, and they're like, well, you hear Bigfoot stories and you hear ghost stories, but you don't hear a lot of these stories. And this, I kind of explain it to people like this. If you had an experience like this, how likely would you be to share that experience? Right. You know what I mean?
Right.
People are going to think you're crazy. People, it's just so far out there. But having interviewed this guy and knowing him back then, and when I interviewed him and stuff, he was very sincere about what he had seen. I truly believe that is what he saw.
Did you ever see in the Into the Fray group page when I still had it up? I should probably put that back up because I've mentioned it like 2 or 3 times now since I've taken it down. Is John Paul's, and of course this is tied to more the demonic side, and that's a whole nother conversation if all that's tied in. But his was gray, greenish skin, and it smiled at him, and it had a mouthful of sharp teeth, right? Like, and that was, and it actually like was waving at him. Like they don't seem to care if people see them. Well, they see them, so.
Right, exactly.
So interesting. Not that I'm saying that, it's one thing or the other. It reminded me of John Paul's creature with the grinning and all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Such a big bag of nope. That was also one of my favorites, so I knew that I had to have you tell that. Thank you so much.
You bet. No, that's one of my favorites too. So.
Yeah, I can see why. It just gives you the creeps. It does. You're like, I'm going to turn the light on now in the house, even though this happened in the woods, but you never know.
You're right.
This next one really made me wonder, and this one follows directly after the Pukwudgie story, whatever we want to label that. It makes me wonder about, what's really going on with the missing people in the woods and, the missing 411, and that's, again, a whole nother subject. But this kind of is, I don't know what to make of this one. So this one is from Chris, and it's called Not My Cousin. This one's also very, very creepy.
Right. So, again, he was another gentleman that came to me through a friend who knew I was collecting stories, and he had this story. So his family was very much into camping and spending summers up in the mountains, and his extended family included. And he remembered when he was around 10, 11, they were camping, him and his cousins and his family, and his cousin was about a year older than him, and they loved to just pal around and go fishing and, everything around camp. And they had met a few other kids from another camp, from a different family, and they had all decided that it was getting late in the afternoon, and they decided they wanted to play hide and seek. And so Chris got chosen to be the seeker. And so he, stayed back and counted, and everybody took off, and he was able to find some of the other kids, but he wasn't able to find his cousin. And so not far from their camp, there was basically a gully that moves up into a canyon that heads towards the south. And so he was looking in the edge of the forest right there for his cousin, thinking, maybe he's up this way. The parents made sure they, left him boundaries. You don't go too far from here, don't. And so he went as far as he felt like, was okay. But all of a sudden, up the trail that he could see, and from behind a tree, he could see his cousin, who was yelling at him, and his cousin is motioning for him to follow him. And he's like, well, maybe he's found something, I don't know. And so he starts heading up the trail that goes up this canyon, and he gets close to the tree, and his cousin disappears, and he gets behind the tree, and his cousin's not there, and he's looking around, and then further up the trail, behind another tree, his cousin's standing back there and motioning in for him to come, excited, and he's a little irritated, but he hikes up the trail, and once again, right before he gets there, his cousin disappears, and looks around, can't find him, and this goes on a couple times, and finally he's up there quite a ways up this trail, and sees his cousin at the end, right to where the trail turns and disappears around the corner. His cousin's there motioning him for him to come, and he's yelling at him that we're too far from camp, we're not supposed to be this far, and his cousin's just smiling at him and trying to wave him on. And at some point he realizes there's something wrong, something doesn't feel right about this. So he turns and starts heading towards camp, and realizes he's way farther than he thought up this trail, and it's getting later. So he's getting nervous, and he actually ends up on a dead run, back to camp. And when he gets back to camp, everybody's around the campfire roasting hot dogs and marshmallows, and his mother scolds him for being so, where have you been? And he says, well, I've been chasing my cousin up the canyon. And that's when he notices his cousin sitting around the fire, and his cousin's looking at him funny, and his mom's like, cousin's been here the whole time. And his cousin had been hiding under the trailer when he went looking, and his cousin never left camp. And so he's really confused, and because he knows he followed his cousin up this trail, and his cousin and even his mother said, no, he was under the trailer, now he's been at the fire, for the last 45 minutes, So it was just really strange to him. Whatever it was trying to lure him away, it was not a good thing, whatever it was. And he often wonders what would have happened if I'd have kept following this thing, whatever it was.
Right, which by all accounts to him seemed like his cousin. That was his cousin, a carbon copy. So at first he's just kind of going, all right, dude, well, I guess we can go up there if you want. Like, where the heck you going?
Right.
And then keeps luring him out there. So, because I know that in the book you said that he kind of was like, well, by the time he was like actually running and worried and he wanted to get back to camp, I think that by the time he got back to camp, it was dark. But during this encounter, there was enough light for him to go, oh, well, there's Trevor. There's my cousin. He's behind that tree. Wait, now he's behind that tree further up. Right. It is so very creepy. And I remember, this is a story that gets brought up all the time with Missing 411, but the little boy that he saw his grandma in a cave, but, she had like the bolts in her neck or whatever. And what in the world? I don't know. What are these carbon copies of our loved ones trying to lure us into places we shouldn't go? How is that impossible?
Yeah, that's, when I heard this story, that was what sprung into my mind too. I've read all of the Missing 411 books and listened to David Pilates. I can never say his name right, but that's what I was thinking as well was, what was this that was luring him away? And, how many kids may have fallen victim to whatever this is. And so, it's really kind of strange. And interesting enough, as a couple weeks ago, I was listening to I can't even remember what it was, but there was people that were talking about interesting situations, and this woman had shared a story where she had something very similar, but she was in a city and had followed her cousin, and it was trying to lure her into an abandoned warehouse or something.
Oh my God.
And it was when she was playing with her cousin. It was supposed to be her cousin too, and so it kind of struck home with me. I'm like, maybe it's not just in the forest, but whatever it is, it's very interesting that they would. And the other thing too is, it was his older cousin, and so he mentioned, he looked up to his older cousin. If it was a younger cousin, he would have stopped a long time ago, but
Right.
he trusted his older cousin. Thought it was his older cousin, and so it was really interesting.
I listened to Clyde Lewis quite a bit. I'm sure you've heard me mention his show, Ground Zero. And in fact, just on his most recent show, he was bringing up the fact that, I don't know if it's still up there now, but he's like, people are just sharing so much information about themselves, much more than where they're from or who they're married to. But I guess he said something like, oh, Facebook wants to know your blood type. And why do they need to know your blood type? Well, also he goes, we've got Ancestry.com and 23andMe. And he goes, what do you guys really think that that's for? Clyde's like kind of going, they're doing wonky stuff with your DNA. And something about, there was New Mexico, they, in a house, or maybe it was a warehouse, but there was a number of kids that were being kept there and they were malnourished and obviously being trafficked for what looked like some kind of mind control experiment. Oh, wow. So, he's like, I don't know why people are sharing so much information, but he goes, it's 20-something million people have sent their spit and their DNA into these ancestry places. And he goes, I don't really think that we know what they're doing with that stuff. That's
true. That's a lot of information of your ancestry. And if you notice too, David, in his Missing 411 books, mentions that it's a certain ancestry of people that seem to be missing. It's the Germanic kind of back history of people that seem to be missing and being taken. And so, if, they know where you're from and they can look it up. And as we know, anything can be hacked anymore.
Yes.
Between Target and all these other places, you losing your information, you could lose, anybody could know about your ancestry and your history. So,
and after hearing stories like this, you're like, well, maybe they are making copies of people and to lure. I mean, that's a whole conspiracy show and everything else. I realize that, but it's at least interesting to talk about and try to be like, well, there might be a thread there that leads somewhere, who knows. But
yeah, exactly,
like you said, that's a great point, that was an older cousin, someone he looked up to, someone he obviously did start to follow into the woods, where he shouldn't have been going so far from camp, but he did. And occasionally things seem to kick in and get you back to safety, but it sounds like in some of these cases, maybe they kept following and they got to that point of no return.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I often wondered too, with the Missing 411, if the answer isn't with people who have had similar experiences and escaped,
right,
but are afraid to share their story because it might seem so strange.
Exactly. I know. I completely agree. I really do wish more people would come forward and either just talk to David and keep it anonymous, or talk to, one of us that has one of these shows to get the word out there. But it does seem like this stuff goes on a lot more than we would like to admit. And I'm sure that there's a ton of people out there that have similar stories that don't want to admit it, because it does sound so strange. Because you're like, I was following my cousin into the woods, and mom's like, the heck are you talking about? He's right here. Like, looking at you like you're nuts, and you probably feel a little crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that one was kind of a sobering one. I'm like, that would be a horrible situation, because I know that at least according to some of these cases, they go too far and they don't come back.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Well, I thought we would culminate the whole thing with what I mentioned in the beginning, and it's the shadow figures, and these are different than mine, of course, because mine were not as massive. And there was 4 of them and not 3 of them.
Right.
in the show Monsters Among Us podcast by my friend Derek Hayes, have you ever heard of his mirrored men stories that he gets? They're kind of actually original to his show. It was the first time that I think any of us had ever heard the mirrored men, and now he's starting to get more of these. But I believe the stories are always, there's 3 of them, but they always move as if it's just one entity. They move exactly the same. That's why they get the moniker mirrored men.
The mirrored men.
Yeah. And I don't think that as far as for our purposes today, that's exactly the same thing. But the fact that there were 3 of them makes it kind of interesting. We see the number 3 in a lot of paranormal stories kind of throughout different veins. But anyhow, this one is called Ridge Watchers, and Cam is the one that told you this story.
Yes. So Cam came to me when he heard that I was collecting stories, and he'd grown up in the western part of Wyoming near the Wind River Range. And if you know anything about the Wind River Range, it's a big wilderness area. It's south of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It's on the western side, where western side of Wyoming is really mountainous, and then the further towards the east, the more and south, the more flat it gets. But he started out by telling me about some of the experiences that his grandpa had and told him about, and when he was younger, and he kind of brushed a lot of those off. Different stories. His grandpa had a Bigfoot story and a UFO story, and he loved listening to the stories. But one was about these Ridge Watchers, and he had his own experience when he was about 17. Him and his buddies who had gone into the Wind Rivers, taken their horses, and made camp back quite a ways back into the Wind Rivers. And it was getting to be dusk, and they noticed first a couple of these dark masses at the top of this ridge, and they had binoculars. They went and got the binoculars and looked, and it just looked like a black, huge, tall individual mass that stood up near the top. And they got darker and darker as it got darker. And before long, another one came up, and he was estimating them to be like 20 feet tall. I mean, like really enormous, and just standing at the top and overlooking, the little valley where they were camping, and which was just like the story that his grandpa had told him growing up, that he had seen a couple times in the Wind Rivers. So they watched him with the binoculars until it got so dark that you couldn't see anymore, and they stayed up all night, because they were really kind of freaked out by this whole thing. I mean, they're back 40 miles into the wilderness. Nobody is around. And obviously these black masses, giants that look like giants, were overlooking their camp before the night came. And the next morning when it got light enough, they got the horses and rode up to the top of the ridge where they had been, and there was absolutely no sign of anything up there. They couldn't find tracks of any sort, anything that would suggest that there was giants standing up there or anything like that. What's interesting is after he told me this story, I kind of did some research, and there are similar stories to this, but they all seem to emanate from California, the mountain range there between California and Nevada, the Sierra Nevadas. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a place where they do see very similar things to these giant black figures that will just show up on the ridgeline overlooking, but they don't seem to be an actual creature in the fact that they don't leave any trace whatsoever.
Mm. I mean, yeah, I don't even know where to begin to guess what these things are, right? And they're so massive. He says he was guessing 20 feet by the time they got up there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just enormous, whatever they were. And like I said, they had binoculars, but when they looked, it just looked like a black mass up there. And they only showed up when it started getting, the sun started setting, it started getting dusk, kind of a thing. And that goes along with a lot of the other stories that I read of them happening in the Sierra Nevadas and also in threes, it seems to be. So
in those other stories, John, because in this one, they noticed the first one and then the other two joined a short time later. Did you find any similar stories?
They didn't seem to say if they all showed up together or if they were just there. It seemed like a lot of the times they just noticed them and then they were there, the three of them. So, so this was a little bit strange that way, in that there was the two and then the other one finally showed up shortly thereafter. So,
and it is interesting, like the the aspects of the granite or what's in the ground or their water around, right? And some of these different conductor ideas for things like this. But, the watchers, 20 feet tall on the ridgeline, I'd be like, probably not sleeping tonight. That's a little creepy.
Right. And they didn't either. They just stoked up the fire and tried to make the best of the situation. So. And
see, I wonder what a Native American would think of that story, right? Because I think that they have, I think all these things, they probably have what they would call an explanation for, a reason that they're there. And maybe that's, do you know where the term the Watchers came from for these guys? Or
that was what his grandpa called them. Okay. So that's just what he called them after his grandpa called them that. So. Because I guess it just seemed to him they were just there to watch, I guess. I don't know, but that's just what he called them.
Because he didn't actually see them leave. It just got too dark to see them anymore, right?
Yeah, it just gets too dark and they disappear into the black of the night. So
I don't know. I think that's still better than that damn little troll creature with the sharp teeth being 15 feet away. I think I'd take the Watchers.
Yeah, I think I would too.
They keep their distance.
Yeah.
20 feet tall or not, they're not 15 feet away, so they're good.
Right, exactly.
Still, no sleep. Well, there you go, guys. Enjoy your camping trips. Post the talk with John today. So I've been kind of getting hints that maybe you're still gathering stories for the third?
Yes, I definitely am going to do a third book. So,
awesome.
I would love to hear from anybody who wants to contact me. So
yeah, give out your email and your Facebook or Instagram, whatever kind of social media stuff that you've got, John, for people to contact you.
Okay, my email is OlsenJ, so OLSENJ 243 @gmail.com. You can go to my website, which is strangerbridgerland.com. You can contact me there. You can also check out I have a video for the book, and I have the dates of some of the paranormal cons where I'm going to be talking and speaking, and then also Stranger Bridgerland on Facebook. You can contact me on there.
Perfect. I will make sure to link all that in the old show notes for everybody. Oh, and I got an email. They were like, you mentioned the show notes, but where are the show notes? If you're in your podcatcher of choice, show notes does not allow for any images or anything there. So if I mention, go see this photo or whatever in the show notes, you have to go to intothefrayradio.com, and it's underneath that particular episode. So just so that everybody's clear on that, because iTunes does not let you put in any images. What was I going to say? When this will come out Thursday, the 16th. So is the book going to be out by then, or maybe closer to the end of the week, the very end?
It'll be out either on that day, Thursday or Friday. It'll be you'll be able to order it off of Amazon, either hard copy, or you can get the digital copy off of Amazon.
Awesome. Well, the timing couldn't be better then. I really appreciate you coming back on for the second round, and let me know when the old third, it's time to get you back on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shannon. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. You are so welcome. Thank you, John.
Thank you.